There comes a moment in the life of every empath that feels less like a decision and more like a quiet, emotional funeral. Not for another person, but for the version of themselves that kept sacrificing peace just to be loved. For years, they become the emotional shelter for everyone else, the listener, the fixer, the one who absorbs tension before it reaches the room. They carry pain that was never theirs, hoping loyalty will someday be returned with understanding. But eventually, something inside them breaks. Not loudly, not dramatically, silently. Because the empath begins to notice a terrifying pattern. The more they abandon themselves for others, the emptier they become. Their kindness becomes expected, their patience becomes exploited, their presence becomes consumed without gratitude. And one day, after surviving emotional exhaustion disguised as love, they stop asking the question, "How can I save this connection?" and begin asking, "Why am I destroying myself to keep it alive?" That is the moment everything changes. Because peace feels unfamiliar to people who were raised inside emotional chaos. Stillness can feel lonely at first. Boundaries can feel cruel. Silence can feel guilty. But slowly the empath realizes something powerful. Protecting your energy is not selfish. It is survival. And emotional intelligence is not about carrying everyone's emotions. It is about finally learning which emotions belong to you and which never did. The moment an empath chooses peace over people, they stop bleeding for relationships that were never healing them. And in that silence, a new kind of power is born. The day the empath stops explaining themselves. An empath spends most of their life trying to make other people understand their heart. They explain why they reacted emotionally. They explain why something hurt them. They explain their intentions, their loyalty, their silence, their boundaries, their exhaustion. Over and over again, they stand emotionally exposed in front of people who were never truly trying to understand them in the first place. Because deep down, many empaths carry a hidden fear. If people misunderstand me, maybe I'll lose love. So they over-explain. They write long messages trying to clarify their emotions. They replay conversations in their mind at 2 a.m., wondering if they sounded too sensitive, too distant, too emotional, too difficult. They become addicted to emotional correction, constantly trying to fix how others perceive them. And slowly, without realizing it, they begin abandoning their own inner peace just to maintain emotional approval. But eventually, something shifts. The empath realizes that genuine people do not require endless explanations to respect you. People who truly care ask questions instead of making assumptions. They listen instead of twisting your vulnerability into weakness. And the painful truth begins to emerge. Some people were never confused about your heart. They simply benefited from your lack of boundaries. That realization changes everything. Because the day an empath stops over-explaining is the day they begin reclaiming their self-worth. They no longer feel the need to defend every decision or justify every emotion. They stop shrinking themselves into digestible versions for emotionally immature people. They realize peace does not come from being understood by everyone. Peace comes from understanding yourself deeply enough that misunderstanding no longer controls you. And at first, this silence terrifies them. Not responding feels unnatural. Not chasing clarity feels cold. Walking away without defending themselves feels almost guilty. But over time, the empath discovers a powerful truth. Silence is not weakness. Sometimes silence is self-respect, refusing to beg for validation anymore. Because emotionally intelligent people understand something most never learn. Those committed to misunderstanding you will do so no matter how carefully you explain yourself. And the empath finally becomes free the moment they stop turning their soul into a courtroom for other people's opinions. Why peace feels uncomfortable at first? For most empaths, chaos does not feel chaotic in the beginning. It feels familiar. They grow so used to emotional intensity that calmness almost feels wrong. Their nervous system becomes conditioned to constant emotional scanning, watching facial expressions, monitoring moods, predicting tension before it happens. Even in moments of silence, their body remains alert, waiting for conflict that may never come. Survival becomes mistaken for love. And this is why peace can feel deeply uncomfortable at first. When the empath finally steps away from draining relationships, endless emotional labor, and constant people-pleasing, they expect immediate relief. But instead, they often encounter something unexpected: emptiness. The phone becomes quieter, the emotional chaos disappears, the constant rescuing stops, and suddenly they are left alone with themselves. That silence can feel terrifying, because many empaths unknowingly build their identity around being needed. Their value becomes tied to how much pain they can absorb, how many people they can save, how much emotional weight they can carry without collapsing. So when peace finally arrives, the nervous system mistakes it for loneliness instead of safety. This is why some empaths return to toxic environments even after escaping them. Not because they enjoy suffering, but because emotional chaos feels psychologically familiar. The body becomes addicted to emotional intensity the same way a storm-trained mind struggles to trust clear skies. But healing begins when the empath stops confusing peace with emptiness. Slowly, they begin noticing things they could never hear before: their intuition, their exhaustion, their suppressed anger, their neglected dreams. For the first time, they are no longer drowning in everyone else's emotions. They are finally face to face with their own soul. And that moment changes everything, because true peace is not the absence of emotion. It is the absence of constant emotional survival. It is waking up without anxiety controlling your chest. It is no longer fearing someone's mood swings. It is being able to sit alone without feeling guilty for existing outside of other people's needs. At first, peace feels unfamiliar because the empath was trained to associate love with emotional struggle. But over time, their nervous system learns a new truth. Calm is not boredom. Stability is not weakness. And a peaceful life is not an empty life. It is the first safe home they have ever truly lived inside. The hidden power of emotional detachment. One of the greatest misunderstandings about empaths is the belief that healing turns them cold. People assume that once an empath stops tolerating disrespect, stops overgiving, and stops emotionally chasing others, they have somehow changed. But the truth is far deeper than that. The empath did not become heartless. They became emotionally intelligent. Because emotional detachment is not the inability to feel. It is the ability to feel without drowning. And for most empaths, this becomes one of the hardest lessons of their entire life. Before healing, they absorb everything. Other people's anger becomes their anxiety. Other people's sadness becomes their responsibility. Other people's chaos becomes their emotional burden to carry. They enter rooms and unconsciously merge with the emotional atmosphere around them. Without boundaries, their identity slowly dissolves into the needs, moods, and expectations of everyone else. But eventually, exhaustion forces awakening. The empath realizes they cannot heal while emotionally attached to every reaction, every opinion, and every emotional storm around them. So they begin practicing something unfamiliar: distance. Not cruel distance, protective distance. They stop responding immediately to every emotional demand. They stop trying to rescue people committed to self-destruction. They stop internalizing blame that never belonged to them. And for the first time, they understand a life-changing truth. Empathy without boundaries becomes self-destruction. This is where emotional detachment becomes power. Because detached people are harder to manipulate. Guilt loses its control over them. Emotional games stop working. Toxic people become frustrated because the empath no longer reacts the same way. The old version of them would have over-explained, apologized, chased closure, or sacrificed peace to keep the connection alive. But the healed empath begins choosing emotional clarity over emotional captivity. And this transformation confuses people. Some call them distant. Others call them selfish. But what they are actually witnessing is someone finally refusing to abandon themselves for the comfort of others. The empath learns that not every emotion deserves access to their nervous system. Not every conflict deserves a reaction. Not every wounded person deserves unlimited entry into their soul. Because true emotional intelligence is not measured by how much pain you can carry. It is measured by your ability to remain connected to yourself while surrounded by the emotions of others. And the moment an empath masters that balance, they become emotionally untouchable in a way most people will never understand. When empaths realize not everyone deserves access, one of the most painful awakenings an empath experiences is realizing that kindness does not guarantee safety. For years, they move through life believing that if they love deeply enough, forgive patiently enough, and give selflessly enough, people will eventually treat them with the same care in return. But reality teaches them something devastating. Some people are attracted to empaths not because they value them, but because they can use them. And that realization changes the empath forever. Because empaths naturally see potential in people, they look beyond behavior and focus on hidden wounds, hidden pain, hidden goodness. They excuse disrespect because they understand trauma. They tolerate emotional inconsistency because they see suffering behind it. They keep giving chances because their heart always hopes healing is possible. But eventually, the empath notices a brutal pattern. Certain people only appear when they need comfort. Certain people drain emotional energy without ever replenishing it. Certain people demand understanding while refusing accountability. The empath becomes an emotional sanctuary for others while secretly collapsing inside themselves. And slowly, they begin to understand something difficult. Access is a privilege, not a right. Not everyone deserves unlimited entry into your emotions, your time, your peace, or your nervous system. Just because you understand someone's pain does not mean you must sacrifice yourself to carry it. And just because you love someone does not mean they are healthy for you. This realization is deeply painful because empaths often confuse boundaries with rejection. Saying no feels cruel. Pulling away feels selfish. Protecting themselves feels like betrayal. But healing teaches them a powerful truth. Boundaries are not punishment. Boundaries are self-respect in physical form. And once the empath truly understands this, their entire life begins to change. They stop giving unlimited access to emotionally unsafe people. They stop trying to earn love through self-sacrifice. They stop allowing guilt to override intuition. Instead of asking, "How do I keep this person?" they begin asking, Does this connection protect my peace or destroy it? That question becomes the beginning of emotional freedom. Because mature love does not demand your exhaustion as proof of loyalty. Healthy people do not feed on your empathy while ignoring your humanity. And emotionally intelligent empaths eventually learn that protecting their energy is not cruelty. It is wisdom born from finally understanding their own value. The silence that changes everything. There is a specific kind of silence an empath eventually encounters. A silence that does not feel empty but sacred. At first, they fear it. After spending years surrounded by emotional noise, constant demands, endless conversations, and the pressure to emotionally carry everyone around them, silence feels unnatural, almost uncomfortable. But over time, that silence begins to heal them. Because for most of their life, the empath was never truly alone with themselves. Their mind was overcrowded with other people's emotions, problems, expectations, and disappointments. Even in solitude, they were mentally replaying conversations, worrying about someone else's pain, or trying to fix emotional situations that were never theirs to control. Their inner world became a battlefield of emotional responsibility. And one day, they become too exhausted to continue. So they stop chasing, stop rescuing, stop over-explaining, stop forcing connections that only survive through self-abandonment. They withdraw from the emotional performance they once called love. And in that withdrawal, something unexpected begins to happen. They start hearing themselves again. Not the anxious version shaped by survival. Not the people-pleasing version desperate for acceptance. But the deeper self buried underneath years of emotional overextension. The part of them that had been neglected while everyone else received their energy first. And this is where the real transformation begins. Because silence reveals truth. It exposes which relationships depended on your constant emotional labor to survive. It reveals who only valued your availability, your softness, your forgiveness, your healing energy. Some people disappear the moment the empath stops emotionally feeding them. Others become angry because they no longer have unlimited access. And painful as that is, it becomes liberating too. Because the empath finally realizes they were never responsible for carrying everyone else's emotional world. Their purpose was never to bleed endlessly just to keep others comfortable. Peace was never something they had to earn through suffering. In silence, the empath reconnects with their intuition. Their creativity returns. Their nervous system softens. Their soul stops living in survival mode. Solitude no longer feels like abandonment. It feels like protection. And perhaps the greatest lesson of all is this. The empath discovers that loneliness is not the absence of people. It is the absence of connection to yourself. And silence becomes the bridge that finally leads them home. How inner peace becomes personal power. Most people misunderstand power. They think power is dominance, control, attention, or the ability to influence others emotionally. But the empath eventually discovers a deeper kind of strength, one that cannot be seen immediately from the outside. The power of inner peace. Because before healing, the empath's emotions were constantly controlled by external forces. One text could ruin their entire day. One rejection could send them spiraling into self-doubt. One conflict could consume their thoughts for weeks. Their emotional state depended heavily on the moods, validation, and approval of other people. And that is not peace. That is emotional captivity. But something remarkable happens when the empath begins healing their nervous system instead of endlessly managing everyone else's emotions. They become less reactive, less emotionally available to chaos, less controlled by guilt, manipulation, and emotional unpredictability. Situations that once drained them no longer have the same power over their mind. and people notice the difference immediately. Because calmness is intimidating to those who rely on emotional control. Toxic people expect reactions. They expect emotional access. They expect the empath to panic, chase, explain, apologize, or emotionally collapse the moment tension appears. But inner peace changes the empath's energy completely. Now they pause before reacting. Now they observe instead of absorbing. Now they protect their emotional state instead of sacrificing it. And that shift creates quiet power. Because emotional regulation is one of the rarest forms of strength in a world addicted to impulsive reactions. The empath no longer gives everyone unlimited access to their mind. They become intentional with their energy, their attention, and their emotional investment. Instead of constantly asking, "How do others feel about me?" they begin asking, "How do I feel around them?" That question alone transforms their life. Because true confidence is not loud, it is not aggressive, it is not desperate for recognition. Real confidence is emotional stability. It is the ability to remain grounded, even when others try to provoke insecurity, fear, or guilt inside you. And the empath slowly realizes something extraordinary. Peace is not passive. Peace is power under control. It is the ability to walk away without revenge, to remain calm without suppressing truth, to protect your energy without needing permission, to stop shrinking yourself just to maintain connections built on imbalance. And once an empath experiences that level of emotional freedom, they can never fully return to the version of themselves that survived through self-abandonment. The final transformation, becoming untouchable spiritually. The final stage of an empath's transformation is not becoming harder, it is becoming whole. For most of their life, the empath searched for peace through other people, through love, through validation, through emotional closeness. They believed connection would finally heal the emptiness they carried inside. So they gave endlessly, loved deeply, forgave repeatedly, hoping that one day someone would choose them with the same intensity they offered everyone else. But healing changes the empath in a way few people understand. Because eventually, they stop searching outside themselves for emotional completion. And that is when they become spiritually untouchable. Not because pain disappears from their life, not because betrayal no longer hurts, but because their identity is no longer controlled by the behavior of others. Rejection no longer destroys their self-worth. Silence no longer terrifies them. They stop measuring their value by how needed, desired, or emotionally useful they are to people around them. For the first time, they belong to themselves. And that changes their entire energy. The healed empath walks differently through the world. They no longer chase people who withdraw affection to gain control. They no longer beg for understanding from emotionally unavailable individuals. They no longer confuse emotional suffering with deep love. Instead, they become deeply selective with where their energy goes. And this selectiveness creates an almost unshakable presence. Because people can sense when someone is no longer desperate for approval. Manipulation loses its power over those who are emotionally anchored within themselves. Guilt stops working. Emotional games become visible. The empath begins seeing people clearly instead of seeing only their potential. And perhaps most importantly, they stop abandoning themselves to avoid loneliness. That is the true rebirth. Because the spiritually healed empath understands something many never learn in their entire lifetime. Inner peace is more valuable than forced connection. Protecting your soul is more important than maintaining relationships built on emotional exhaustion. And self-respect will always cost less than self-betrayal in the long run. This is the moment the empath becomes untouchable. Not cold, not arrogant, not disconnected, but deeply rooted within themselves. Calm, aware, emotionally free, no longer seeking permission to exist peacefully, no longer apologizing for protecting their spirit, and no longer willing to lose themselves just to keep others comfortable. The moment an empath chooses peace over people, their entire life begins to change from the inside out. They stop measuring love by sacrifice, stop confusing emotional exhaustion with loyalty, stop abandoning themselves just to keep others comfortable. And in that quiet transformation, they discover a truth that most people never fully understand. Inner peace is not weakness, it is power. Because the strongest empath is not the one who absorbs the most pain. It is the one who finally learns when to walk away from it. The one who protects their energy without guilt. The one who can love deeply without losing themselves in the process. And perhaps that is the final lesson of emotional intelligence. Not everyone deserves access to your heart simply because you have the capacity to care. Sometimes the most powerful thing an empath can do is choose silence over chaos, boundaries over self-betrayal, and peace over people who only knew how to consume them. Because the moment you stop fighting to be understood by everyone, you finally become free enough to understand yourself.